The war moved faster than its roads. By the time Britain declared war on the 3rd of September 1939, strategy had already outrun infrastructure, and the gap between ambition and reality widened with every mile an army tried to advance. Guns, trucks, and aircraft could be produced quickly. Passable roads could not. They had to be made, cleared, drained, surfaced, often by hand. In that space between plans and movement, labour became as decisive as firepower. In British West Africa, the opening months of the war unfolded far from the sound of artillery. In the Gold Coast, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia, daily life initially continued with only modest change. Radio bulletins carried news from Europe, regulations increased quietly, and colonial offices expanded their paperwork. Yet beneath that surface calm, officials were already reconsidering long-held assumptions. Experience from the First World War had taught imperial planners that African manpower could sustain campaigns far beyond the continent. What they debated now was not whether to mobilize labor, but how much, how fast, and under what conditions. Before 1939, African labor had been central to colonial economies, on docks, railways, mines, and public works, but it was rarely treated as a military resource in its own right. The early war changed that view. British logistical doctrine recognized that modern campaigns depended on steady supply flows, and those flows depended on terrain that could be crossed in all seasons. Roads, airstrips, depots, and camps were not secondary tasks. They were requirements. Without them, armies stalled. With them, operations became possible. The solution was the expansion of pioneer and labor units, formations designed to turn manpower into mobility. Recruitment began cautiously in late 1939 and accelerated through 1940. Colonial governments relied on a mixture of methods that reflected both urgency and limits. Some men enlisted for wages that exceeded local civilian rates, drawn by regular pay and rations at a time when wartime disruption threatened livelihoods. Others were persuaded through chiefs, district officers, and labor commissioners who framed service as duty or opportunity. In some areas, particularly as quotas rose, recruitment edged toward pressure, using influence rather than open force. The balance differed by colony and over time, but it was never uniform, and it was never entirely voluntary. The official language described these recruits as non-combatants, a term that reassured policymakers while hiding the realities. Pioneer units were not expected to fight, but they would work in forward areas, under harsh conditions, and sometimes within reach of danger. Their role was defined narrowly and deliberately. They were to dig, carry, build, and maintain tasks considered essential but secondary. Rifles were not part of their standard issue, tools were. This distinction shaped everything that followed, from training to command structures to how their contribution would later be remembered. Training depots established across West Africa in 1940 reflected these priorities. Instruction focused less on drill and more on discipline and endurance. Men learned how to clear bush, cut drainage ditches, lay laterite surfaces, and erect temporary structures. They were taught to work in teams under foremen, often African non-commissioned officers, who acted as links between British engineers and labour gangs. Technical expertise remained concentrated at the top. Planning, surveying, and design were the responsibility of Royal Engineers officers. Execution was the responsibility of the pioneers. The hierarchy on work sites was clear. British officers supervised. African NCOs enforced pace and order. The rank and file laboured. Productivity targets mattered more than comfort, and efficiency was measured in yards cleared, culverts laid, and hours worked. Equipment shortages were common in the early years. Shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows were shared or improvised, and mechanized support was limited. Where machinery existed, it was reserved for essential tasks, leaving most work dependent on muscle and repetition. By 1940, the expansion of these units was no longer theoretical. Records from the period show a steady increase in pioneer formations drawn especially from the Gold Coast and Nigeria, where population size and existing labor systems made mobilization easier. Colonial officials framed this as a contribution to a shared imperial war effort, but the lived experience was more immediate. Men left farms, workshops, and families for an uncertain period, often without clear information about where they would be sent. What they knew was that the work would be hard, the climate unfamiliar, and the return date uncertain. The emphasis on labour over combat reflected strategic calculation. Britain faced shortages not only of men, but of transport capacity. Every engineer or infantryman freed from construction duties could be redeployed to fighting roles if labour units took their place. In planning documents from 1940 and 1941, Pioneers appear less as auxiliaries and more as logistical multipliers, units whose presence increased the army's reach without adding rifles to the line. Yet this logic carried moral weight. The classification of African soldiers as non-combatant limited recognition even as it expanded responsibility. They were essential to movement but marginal to the story. Disease, exhaustion, and accident were treated as costs of labor rather than casualties of war. This framing shaped how their service would be recorded and how easily it could later be overlooked. By the end of 1940, training cycles shortened and deployment orders loomed. The question was no longer whether West African labor would be used, but where it would be needed first. The war had already spread beyond Europe, and British forces faced terrain that defeated vehicles as effectively as enemy fire. Somewhere ahead lay roads that did not yet exist, and campaigns that could not begin until they did. The men trained with shovels and picks were about to learn where those roads would be built, and why the war depended on them. The uniform suggested a soldier. The equipment did not. For the West African pioneers assembling at training depots in 1940 and 1941, the most familiar objects were not rifles or bayonets but shovels, picks, axes, and crowbars. The distinction was deliberate. From the outset, these men were being prepared not to fight an enemy, but to confront terrain, soil, water, forest, and distance. In British planning, this was where the war would be won or lost. Training camps across the Gold Coast and Nigeria reflected the urgency of the moment. Facilities expanded quickly, often reusing existing labor depots or military sites with minimal change. Instruction moved at speed. There was little time for ceremonial drill or extended classroom teaching. What mattered was output. Men were taught how to clear bush efficiently, how to dig drainage channels that would survive heavy rain, how to surface roads with laterite, and how to build simple culverts from stone, timber, or corrugated metal. Precision mattered less than endurance and repetition. Equipment shortages shaped every stage of this process. Britain's industrial capacity was stretched thin, prioritized for combat units and frontline formations. Labor units received what remained. Tools were often worn, mismatched, or limited in number. A single pick or shovel might be shared among several men, rotated through long shifts. Where wheelbarrows existed, they were valued. Where they did not, loads were carried by hand or on improvised stretchers. Mechanized equipment was rare and, when available, reserved for tasks judged essential by supervising engineers. Oversight came from the Royal Engineers, whose officers planned work sites, set targets, and reported progress up the chain of command. Their presence defined the structure of pioneer labor. African non-commissioned officers and foremen occupied a narrow but vital middle ground. They translated orders, enforced discipline, and maintained pace, often under pressure from both sides. Below them were the rank-and-file workers, organized into gangs whose effectiveness depended on coordination rather than individual skill. This hierarchy was reinforced daily. British officers rarely handled tools themselves. Their role was to survey, measure, and decide. African NCOs corrected technique and pushed output. The laborers dug. The system was efficient by design, but it also revealed clear limits. Training produced competence, not expertise. Pioneers could reliably carry out tasks, but they were not expected to design solutions or innovate beyond the instructions. Technical authority remained firmly with the engineers. Classification as non-combatant shaped discipline as well as training. Pioneer units were governed by military law, but their duties were framed as work rather than service in the usual sense. Absence from parades or weapons training did not mean absence from pressure. Productivity targets were set and enforced, sometimes rigidly. Reports from the period stressed output, miles cleared, yards surfaced, hours worked. When targets were missed, explanations were demanded. Fatigue and illness were noted, but rarely allowed to slow schedules for long. The physical demands were relentless. Training days were long, often extending beyond daylight in equatorial conditions. Heat and humidity drained energy quickly, and protective clothing was minimal. Minor injuries, blisters, cuts, strains were common and usually untreated beyond basic first aid. Disease posed a quieter threat. Malaria, dysentery, and respiratory infections spread easily in crowded camps. Medical services existed, but they were limited, and prevention depended largely on discipline and luck. Despite these conditions, the system produced results. By late 1941, British reports describe pioneer units as dependable and adaptable within their assigned roles. Their value lay not in technical brilliance but in scale. They could be deployed in large numbers, sustained on basic rations, and directed toward repetitive tasks that freed skilled engineers and combat troops for other duties. In an army stretched across multiple theaters, this mattered. Yet the limits of this model were equally clear. The absence of weapons training increased vulnerability. Pioneers were expected to work in areas considered secure, but war rarely respected such boundaries. Even during training, rumors circulated about deployment to distant fronts, places where roads were few, climates unfamiliar, and the line between rear and front uncertain. The men knew they were being prepared for something larger than camp routines, even if details remained vague. Communication about deployment was limited, orders flowed downward, but explanations were scarce. Many recruits did not know whether they would serve months or years, or how far from home they would be sent. Letters offered reassurance rather than detail. For colonial authorities, uncertainty reduced resistance. For the men, it sharpened anxiety. By early 1942, training cycles shortened further. The demand for labor outpaced the ability to prepare it slowly. Camps shifted from instruction to throughput, producing units judged fit for work rather than fully prepared. The emphasis was on readiness to endure rather than mastery of technique. What mattered was whether a unit could be moved quickly and put to work immediately. The final weeks in camp were often the hardest. Equipment was issued and reissued, records checked, and units reorganized. Medical inspections removed the unfit, though standards varied. Those who remained packed tools rather than weapons. They were told to expect heat, rain, and long hours. They were not told where they were going. By the time departure orders arrived, the distinction between training and service had blurred. The camps had already functioned as work sites, and the men had learned what was expected of them. Sustained effort, limited rest, and obedience to a system that measured worth in output. Ahead lay unfamiliar terrain and a war defined by movement. The tools packed beside them were not symbols of preparation, but of necessity. Where they were going, progress would still be measured not in miles marched, but in earth moved. Campaigns stall where roads do not exist. In East Africa, that truth confronted Allied planners long before enemy fire did. When West African pioneer units began arriving in 1941, they entered a theatre shaped less by battlefields than by distance, climate and terrain that resisted movement at every turn. Armies could be landed, supplied, and commanded only as far as transport allowed. Beyond that point, progress slowed to the pace of men on foot. The landscape they encountered differed sharply from the regions they had left behind. In parts of East Africa, open savanna gave way to rocky escarpments, flood-prone plains, and stretches of bush that swallowed paths within weeks if left unattended. Seasonal rains turned tracks into mud and dust into ruts. Existing roads, where they existed at all, were narrow, poorly drained, and unsuitable for sustained military traffic. Trucks broke down quickly, animals faltered, supplies piled up at bottlenecks that maps had failed to predict. For British forces operating in the region during 1941 and 1942, mobility depended on construction. Bases required access routes that could carry fuel, ammunition, and food in all weather. Airfields needed to have cleared ground and stable surfaces to support transport aircraft. Camps required water points, drainage, and waste systems to prevent disease. These tasks fell directly to the pioneer units now disembarking from long sea journeys, often with little time to adjust. Work began almost immediately. Pioneer gangs were assigned to stretches of road judged critical by Royal Engineers survey teams. The process was methodical. Bush was cleared first, cut back far enough to reduce regrowth and improve airflow. Drainage channels were dug alongside future roadbeds to carry away rainwater. The surface itself was built up in layers, using laterite soil compacted by hand and, where available, by light rollers. Culverts were placed at low points to prevent washouts. Each stage depended on steady labor rather than speed. Climate shaped every decision. In dry months, dust choked lungs and machinery alike. In the rain, water undermined days of work in hours. Schedules were adjusted constantly, though rarely eased. When rains arrived early or lingered longer than expected, labor hours increased to compensate. Progress was measured carefully, but rarely at a pace that matched expectations set far from the worksite. The human cost was largely indirect but persistent. Disease spread quickly in temporary camps set close to work sites. Malaria was a constant presence, joined by dysentery and respiratory infections. Exhaustion increased vulnerability. Long hours of physical labor under the equatorial sun left little margin for recovery. Casualty figures from the period are uneven and often incomplete. but archival reports acknowledge steady losses from illness and accident rather than combat. Despite these losses, the impact of the work was clear. As roads improved, supply convoys moved farther and more reliably. Fuel reached forward positions that had previously relied on animal transport or limited airdrops. Units once tied to railheads gained operational flexibility. In official assessments, the contribution of labor units was often reduced to a line item: roads completed, airstrip serviceable, but those entries translated directly into movement on the ground. Airfields were among the most demanding projects. Clearing suitable ground required removing vegetation down to the roots, leveling uneven surfaces, and ensuring sufficient drainage to prevent flooding. Surfaces were compacted repeatedly, sometimes strengthened with locally available materials. Maintenance followed construction without pause. Aircraft traffic quickly damaged runways, especially during wet seasons, and repair crews worked continuously to keep them usable. The success of air supply depended as much on these efforts as on the aircraft themselves. The relationship between pioneer units and combat formations was practical and uneven. Infantry and armored units depended on completed roads, but rarely witnessed the labor that sustained them. When work went well, it was invisible. When it failed, pressure flowed downward. Requests for faster completion arrived with little adjustment for conditions on the ground. For the pioneers, this meant longer shifts and reduced rest rather than revised plans. Yet within these limits, adaptability emerged. African foremen and NCOs adjusted work rhythms to local conditions, pacing labor through the hottest hours and pushing harder when temperatures fell. Informal knowledge built up quickly: which soils held under rain, which slopes required extra drainage, and where flooding would return. This experience rarely appeared in official reports, but it improved outcomes over time. By late 1942, the strategic picture was changing. Attention shifted away from East Africa as operations concluded and resources were redirected. The roads built there did not disappear with the campaigns. They remained in use, supporting occupation forces, local transport, and post-war administration. Their existence reflected months of sustained labor that had enabled movement where none had been possible before. For the pioneer units, however, East Africa was not an endpoint. Orders arrived for redeployment, often with little warning. The war demanded labor elsewhere, in regions where terrain posed even greater challenges. As camps were dismantled and equipment packed, the men left behind roads that carried others forward. Ahead lay longer journeys, unfamiliar climates, and a theater where distance and jungle would test both bodies and systems beyond anything yet experienced. From savanna to jungle, the transition was neither smooth nor brief. As Allied strategy shifted in 1942, British planners faced a new crisis thousands of miles from East Africa. In Burma, Japanese advances exposed the weakness of Allied supply lines, and the loss of established routes placed enormous pressure on alternatives that barely existed. Roads were few, railways vulnerable, and air transport limited. What the theatre demanded above all was labour, large numbers of it, capable of building infrastructure where maps showed little more than green space. The decision to redeploy West African pioneer units followed this logic. By mid to late 1942, orders were issued to move labour formations from Africa to Asia, often via the Middle East and India. The scale of the transfer created logistical challenges of its own. Men, tools, and minimal equipment had to be shipped across oceans already crowded with combat troops, supplies, and refugees. Shipping space was scarce, schedules unpredictable, and delays common. For the pioneers, the journey itself became an extension of service, marked by long periods of waiting interrupted by sudden movement. Transit camps in the Middle East served as staging points. Here climates shifted again from equatorial heat to dry conditions, and routines adjusted accordingly. Accommodation was temporary and often overcrowded. Supplies were adequate but basic. Medical inspections attempted to screen out those unfit for further deployment, though standards varied under pressure to maintain numbers. For many men, this was their first experience of regions beyond Africa, and the dislocation was profound. Language, food, and surroundings reinforced the sense of distance from home. India marked another transition. By the time pioneer units arrived there in late 1942 and early 1943, the Burma campaign had settled into a grinding struggle shaped by terrain as much as by enemy action. British and Indian forces required roads to move men and supplies toward the front, but construction now meant confronting dense jungle, steep gradients, and a monsoon cycle that punished any mistake in planning or drainage. The methods learned in Africa were still relevant, but they had to be adapted quickly. Retraining focused on survival as much as technique. Jungle conditions demanded constant attention to rot, insects, and water damage. Tools rusted quickly. Clothing deteriorated. Camps required raised platforms and improved drainage to remain usable. Engineers stressed the importance of clearing wide margins along roadways to slow regrowth and reduce ambush risk, even in rear areas. Work rhythms changed, with early starts and enforced pauses to avoid the worst heat and humidity. Cultural dislocation increased physical strain. Many West African pioneers had been prepared for hardship, but not for the sensory overload of the jungle, the constant noise, the closeness, the absence of horizon. The feeling of enclosure contrasted sharply with the open spaces of Africa. Letters home, when they could be sent, struggled to describe the experience. For colonial authorities, morale was a concern, but maintaining output remained the priority. Transport logistics within India added further complexity. Railways moved units toward the eastern frontier, but capacity was limited, and competition fierce. Labor units were frequently rerouted or delayed to accommodate combat formations. When rail transport ended, marches resumed, often along incomplete routes that the pioneers themselves would soon be ordered to improve. The line between transit and work blurred as men labored even as they moved toward their assigned areas. British planners described this redeployment as a necessity rather than a choice. Reports from the period stressed the shortage of local labor in forward areas and the urgency of sustaining Allied positions. West African units were considered reliable, disciplined, and used to hard work, qualities that justified their continued use far from home. Less attention was paid to cumulative fatigue or the psychological toll of repeated relocation. By early 1943, pioneer units were absorbed into the broader engineering effort, supporting operations into Burma. Their tasks expanded to include not only road construction, but also the clearing and maintenance of airstrips that allowed transport aircraft to bypass impassable ground. These air routes were lifelines, but they depended on constant upkeep. Rain could make a strip unusable overnight. Repair crews worked continuously, often under challenging conditions, to keep them operational. The strategic stakes were clear. Without reliable roads and airfields, Allied forces could not advance, resupply, or even hold their positions during the monsoon. Every yard of cleared ground extended the reach. Yet progress remained fragile. Jungle growth reclaimed abandoned work quickly, and completed sections required constant maintenance. The war in Burma would not be decided quickly, and infrastructure would never be finished, only maintained. As 1943 progressed, the focus shifted from preparation to execution. Roads that had existed only on paper began to take shape under relentless labor. Camps moved closer to the front, narrowing the gap between rear and forward areas. The pioneers, still classified as non-combatants, now worked in environments shaped by active conflict, even if their tasks remained unchanged. Ahead lay the most demanding phase of their service. In Burma, the jungle would test not only physical endurance, but the limits of a system built on labor without recognition. Progress would be slow, measured not in miles gained, but in yards taken from terrain that resisted every step. Progress in Burma was measured in yards per day. In a theater defined by jungle, mountains, and monsoon, distance could not be rushed. Every advance depended on what could be built behind it, and every road existed only as long as it could be maintained. By 1943, West African pioneer units were fully absorbed into this rhythm, working in conditions that tested both the limits of labor and the assumptions of planning. The jungle imposed its own rules. Dense vegetation limited visibility and airflow, trapping heat and moisture close to the ground. Soil changed sharply over short distances, shifting from firm laterite to clay that collapsed under weight. Rainfall arrived suddenly and heavily, turning cleared ground into mud within hours. In such conditions, road construction became a continuous process rather than a one-time task. Clearing, draining, surfacing, and repairing overlapped constantly, with little difference between building new routes and saving old ones from decay. Work began with clearance. Vegetation was cut back well beyond the road's edges to slow regrowth and improve drainage. Routes were dug out where possible, though time and tools rarely allowed full removal. Drainage ditches followed, often deeper and wider than those built in Africa, designed to carry monsoon runoff away from the roadbed. Culverts were installed at frequent intervals, using timber, stone, or prefabricated materials when available. Each culvert was a potential weak point. If it clogged or collapsed, entire sections could be lost. Surfacing demanded patience. Laterite, where accessible, was spread and compacted by hand, layer by layer. In other areas, crushed stone or gravel had to be hauled from distant sources, increasing labor demands. Rollers were scarce and often shared among multiple work sites. Where none were available, compaction relied on repeated foot traffic and improvised methods. The result was rarely smooth, but it was functional enough to carry trucks, artillery, and supply convoys forward. Airstrip construction followed similar principles but allowed even less margin for error. Sites were chosen for relative flatness and good drainage, then quickly cleared. Surfaces were leveled and compacted repeatedly, with constant attention to standing water. Aircraft landings damaged runways quickly, especially during wet periods, and maintenance teams worked almost continuously to keep them usable. In official reports, these airstrips appeared as brief entries, operational, serviceable, yet each update concealed days of labor. Enemy threat was uneven but real. Although pioneer units were not intended to operate under fire, the shifting nature of the Burma front meant that work sometimes took place within reach of patrols or air attack. In such cases, labor continued with minimal protection. The classification of non-combatant did not remove risk, it only shaped how that risk was recorded. When casualties occurred, they were listed as accidents or illness rather than combat losses, reinforcing their invisibility in official counts. The relationship between pioneers and combat units sharpened under these conditions. Infantry and support formations depended directly on completed roads to move and resupply. Construction delays caused shortages at the front. Requests for speed increased, often without regard for terrain or weather. For the pioneers, this pressure showed itself in longer shifts and reduced rest. The pace of work was driven not by what was sustainable, but by what operations demanded. Yet the impact of completed infrastructure was immediate. Where roads held, convoys moved. Artillery reached positions that had previously been unreachable. Medical evacuation improved, reducing the time wounded soldiers spent in the jungle. Air supply routes expanded as new strips came online. These gains built upon each other. Each completed section reduced reliance on porters and animal transport, improving overall efficiency. Despite this, recognition remained limited. Official announcements credited advances to tactical decisions and combat performance. The labor that enabled those movements remained largely unmentioned. Within the engineering hierarchy, Royal Engineers received formal recognition for successful projects, while pioneer units were cited collectively, if at all. Individual effort disappeared into combined figures. The monsoon of 1944 revealed the fragility of these gains. Heavy rains washed out sections of road that had taken months to complete. Culverts failed, slopes collapsed, repair became as urgent as construction, diverting labor from planned extensions to emergency maintenance. In some areas, progress stopped entirely until conditions improved. The lesson was clear: infrastructure in Burma was temporary, always at risk of being undone. Still, work continued. The war required movement, and movement required roads, however temporary. Pioneer units adapted by strengthening drainage, widening clearances, and learning from repeated failures. Knowledge grew through experience rather than manuals. What worked one season was adjusted the next. By late 1944, Allied advances gained momentum. Roads pushed deeper into contested areas, narrowing the distance between supply and front lines. Victory began to feel possible, but it carried a cost measured in fatigue rather than casualties. For the pioneers, months of continuous labor had worn down reserves of strength. Bodies carried the strain of repetition, illness lingered, and morale weakened under constant pressure. As operations continued, the question shifted from how fast roads could be built to how long the labor force could endure. The system that had turned manpower into mobility now faced its own limits. Ahead lay the final phase of the war, and the reckoning that followed when labor, pushed beyond sustainability, began to push back in quieter ways. What happens when labor runs out of strength? By 1944, this question hung over the rear areas of the Burma theatre as steadily as the monsoon clouds. The West African pioneers had been at work for years, recruited, trained, redeployed, and driven from one project to the next with little pause. The system that relied on their endurance now met the limits of the human body. Fatigue became the defining condition of the final war years. Continuous heavy labor, combined with limited recovery time, wore men down gradually, rather than suddenly. The illness lasted longer, injuries healed more slowly. Tasks that once felt routine demanded greater effort. Medical officers noted rising sickness rates, but the pressure to maintain output rarely eased. Roads still needed repair, airstrips still required constant upkeep. Supply lines could not be allowed to fail. Morale declined in a similar fashion. Early expectations of limited service had long since disappeared. Many pioneers had been away from home for years, often with infrequent or delayed communication. News of family hardship arrived unevenly, filtered through letters or rumors. The distance between effort and recognition widened. Work continued, but motivation narrowed into obligation. Control measures tightened in response. British authorities were aware that labour shortages could threaten operations. Discipline was enforced through military regulations applied to non-combatant units, blurring the line between civilian labour and martial law. Punishments for absence, refusal, or perceived laziness ranged from loss of privileges to confinement, depending on the circumstances and the commanding officer. Official reports described these measures as necessary to maintain efficiency, rarely noting their long-term effect on morale. Coercion did not always appear openly. Work schedules were extended, rest days were delayed, medical leave was closely examined. African NCOs, placed between British officers and labourers, carried much of the strain. They were expected to maintain productivity while managing resentment from below and pressure from above. Their authority depended on trust as much as enforcement, and that balance became harder to maintain as exhaustion deepened. Resistance, when it appeared, was usually subtle. Slowdowns replaced refusals. Errors increased. Some men briefly absented themselves, disappearing into nearby areas before returning days later. Others filed complaints through official channels, citing illness or unfair treatment. Desertion occurred, though numbers are hard to confirm and varied by unit and period. Archival sources note the issue cautiously, often framing it as sickness or confusion rather than as a deliberate protest. British concerns over control appear clearly in correspondence from late 1944 and early 1945. Commanders worried not only about productivity, but about precedent. A breakdown in discipline among labour units could spread, weakening the wider logistics system. Measures were introduced to steady conditions, rotations where possible, small improvements in rations, and occasional leave. These changes helped slightly, but did not solve the deeper problem of accumulated strain. At the same time, the strategic situation improved. Allied advances in Burma accelerated as Japanese forces retreated. Roads built under extreme pressure now carried steady traffic. Supply flows stabilized. The sense that the end of the war was near filtered slowly through camps and work sites. For some, it brought relief. For others, it sharpened frustration at the thought of continued labor, even as victory approached. The contradiction was hard to ignore. The pioneers had enabled movement across some of the most difficult terrain of the war, yet remained classified in ways that limited recognition. Their losses, mainly from disease, accident, and exhaustion, did not fit traditional stories of sacrifice. As operations slowed, questions emerged quietly. When would they return home, and what would remain of their service once the work ended? By early 1945, demobilization planning began, unevenly and without clear schedules. Units continued to work even as rumors of peace spread. The war's final months were marked by waiting as much as effort, waiting for orders, for transport, for confirmation that the labor demanded of them was finally nearing its end. When the war ended in August 1945, the machinery of logistics did not stop overnight. Roads still needed upkeep, camps had to be dismantled, men had to be moved, processed and returned across vast distances. For the West African pioneers, the end of hostilities did not bring immediate rest. It marked a shift into another phase, one defined not by building roads for war, but by leaving them behind, largely unseen, as they made their way home. The roads remained, recognition did not. When the war formally ended in August 1945, silence replaced urgency across many of the work sites where West African pioneers had labored for years. Machinery slowed, schedules eased, and orders shifted from expansion to closure. Yet for the men who had built the infrastructure of movement, the end of fighting did not mean an immediate return home. The system that had mobilized them now had to unwind, and that process was slow, uneven, and largely administrative. Demobilization unfolded in stages. Pioneer units were not disbanded overnight. They were processed, reassigned, and gradually repatriated as shipping became available. Records from late 1945 and 1946 show men waiting months in camps across India and the Middle East, carrying out maintenance tasks or light duties while transport was arranged. Roads still needed attention, depots still had to function, and camps still required order. Labor continued, even as the war that had justified it was over. For many, the delay was confusing. Expectations of a quick return clashed with reality. Communication remained limited, and official explanations were brief. The war had demanded patience and endurance. Peace demanded more of the same. When repatriation finally began, it followed the same routes that had once carried men outward by rail to ports, by ship across oceans, and finally back to West Africa. Arrival home was rarely ceremonial. Demobilization centers processed men efficiently, issuing pay settlements and discharge papers before releasing them back into civilian life. Some returned with savings built up over years of service. Others found that wages had barely covered the costs of absence. Employment opportunities varied. In some areas, wartime infrastructure projects had expanded local economies. In others, jobs were scarce, and returning laborers competed with those who had never left. The physical effects of service remained. Years of heavy labor left lasting impacts on health, though few medical records tracked long-term outcomes. Experience gained in construction translated unevenly into civilian work. Skills were practical but informal, learned through repetition rather than certification. For some, this made work on post-war roads, railways, or public works easier. For others, the transition was sudden, marked by a return to subsistence farming or casual labor. Public memory offered little recognition. Victory stories focused on battles, leaders, and combat units. Labor formations appeared, if at all, as footnotes. Memorials rarely mentioned non-combatant units, and official histories treated their contribution collectively rather than individually. The classification that had defined their service during the war now shaped how it was remembered. What had been essential to movement became marginal in memory, yet the infrastructure endured. Roads cut through East African terrain continued to carry traffic long after uniforms vanished. Airstrips cleared in Burma supported post-war administration and regional transport before being reclaimed by vegetation or repurposed. These physical traces stood as quiet evidence of work that had once been urgent and exhausting, now absorbed into everyday landscapes. The moral tensions of that labor were not resolved by demobilization. Recruitment methods, conditions of service, and differences in recognition remained largely unexamined in the immediate post-war years. Colonial administrations shifted to new priorities, and global attention turned to reconstruction in Europe and political change elsewhere. The experiences of West African pioneers faded into archival files and scattered memories. Understanding their role reshapes how the war itself is understood. Victory depended not only on strategy and combat, but on systems sustained by labor far from headlines. Roads were not incidental to operations, they were operations. Every advance, every supply convoy, every evacuation rested on the work of those who built and maintained the routes beneath them. The West African pioneers did not leave behind monuments or medals that clearly marked their contribution. What they left were roads, temporary, fragile, and indispensable. In following those roads, the war appears not only as a series of battles, but as a vast engineering effort shaped by hands that rarely entered the story, yet carried it forward all the same. This war was won not only with weapons, but with work, by hands that built the roads history rarely names. Like the video, if these hidden stories matter, share it so they're not forgotten, and subscribe for more deep dive WWII documentaries. Every road has a story. Stay with the channel to keep uncovering the ones beneath the surface.